Well, I think most people realize that the gimmick that I've used throughout my career has been the King. Jerry the King Lawler, known worldwide. The man that I first got the crown and robe from originally was a guy by the name of Bobby Shane, and he was wrestling as King Bobby Shane back in the 70s. And I wound up with his crown and his robe after Bobby Shane died in a plane crash. For a long time, of course, being from Memphis, Tennessee, called myself the King of Memphis. And I guess that was because Memphis is sort of famous for being the home of kings. Elvis Presley was from Memphis, and so that there was no confusion, I made everybody in my own hometown know that I was the King of Memphis, not Elvis. I'd been a wrestling fan all my life, and my next door neighbor, Mike Mashburn, and I would wrestle around my house, and we didn't have mats, we didn't have a ring or anything like that. We just go out in the backyard and wrestle. I guess it was the early days of backyard wrestling. And finally one day I met another young guy named Jerry Vickers who came along, and he told me about some what we called in those days, I guess, outlaw wrestling matches. Just a little small independent organization that was run by an old ex-wrestler. I remember Jerry said, whatever you do, don't tell him you've never had a match because he won't use you. He said, just tell him that you've wrestled some down in Florida or somewhere. And so that's what happened. Met the promoter, and first question he asked me was, how many matches you had? And I said, just a few. Wrestled some down in Florida. And then, of course, he caught me in the lie by asking me who the promoter was in Florida that I wrestled for. I had no idea. But I was also working at a radio station at the time, and I was a DJ, and I instead of getting blown off, I promised the guy that if I could get the opportunity to wrestle, that I could plug his matches on the radio without him having to pay for it. So next thing you know, I was booked in my first match in West Memphis, Arkansas, and Jackie Fargo was more or less my mentor. He was a big fan favorite. He was a hero throughout the Memphis and Mid-South area, and he was my favorite wrestler to watch. And then it was just like to actually finally get to meet Jackie and get to know him. And Jackie was the guy who stuck his neck out for me after I'd started wrestling over in the little small organization in West Memphis, Arkansas. Jackie stuck his neck out and went to the main promoter there in Memphis, who was a guy by the name of Nick Goulis, and said, Nick, I got a kid down here that I think you should take a look at. I was known more or less as a guy that would be a fighter more so than a wrestler. And my big move that I perfected over the years, and that was my finishing maneuver, finishing hold, so to speak, was the pile driver. And that really came into prominence when I used it on Andy Kaufman, and it caught on. It was seen all around the world, and so I started using the pile driver then as my, the King's, when the King put a pile driver on somebody, that was definitely the end of the match. It's funny, still to this day, when people talk about Jerry the King Lawler, hardcore wrestling fans and people that are just casual wrestling fans and people that really don't even know much at all about wrestling still know and think of my most famous or infamous match as being the match that I had with Andy Kaufman. And of course, Andy Kaufman wasn't a wrestler. He was the Latka, the star of the TV show Taxi at the time, and had been on in all sorts of comedy shows, Saturday Night Live and that sort of thing. And Andy was a huge wrestling fan, and he fancied himself a wrestler, but of course he didn't think he was tough enough to wrestle men, so he challenged women to wrestling matches and declared himself the intergender wrestling champion. And so Andy came down to Memphis, and basically all Andy wanted to do was wrestle a woman in front of a wrestling crowd. He did that. He fell in love with it. Andy actually once told me, he said, I would give up everything that I'm doing in Hollywood, give up Taxi, all the comedy clubs, anything, if I could just stay involved with wrestling. That's how much he loved it. So I came up with the idea. I basically was trying to get the rub off of Andy Kaufman. I came up with the idea that Andy have his first ever match with a man, and that man was going to be me. And so that's how that match came about. Andy got a couple of pile drivers from me in that match, and he wound up spending 3 days in traction in a hospital here in Memphis. And that news and the footage of that match went out all over the world. It was on the front page of the New York Times. And eventually, of course, Andy and I wound up on the David Letterman show. And I like to think that Andy and I broke a lot of ground. We set some trends there. I think Jerry Springer might have been in the audience that night and realized that he was seeing a good thing when I became the first ever talk show guest to strike another guest on network television. Because that's where, we ended up slapping Andy's face, knocked him right out of his chair in front of David Letterman. David had no idea what was taking place. He was in shock. The whole audience was in shock. The world was in shock. That was recently voted by Entertainment Weekly as one of the top 100 moments in the history of television. So without a doubt, that's probably the most famous match or the best known match that I've ever been involved in. Because you still see it 20 years later. They show it like once a week on Comedy Central. It's on A&E. It's on the E! Network. And, of course, we made a movie about it, Man on the Moon, starring Jim Carrey and yours truly as the King. Well, let me just say this about this match that we're going to have tonight. You are in a world of trouble because you have put your name on the dotted line to step into the ring with the King of Wrestling. That's right, me, Jerry the King Lawler. And what I'm going to do to you tonight is not going to be a pretty sight. I don't know if you've ever seen your own blood, but it makes a man feel different about himself when he looks down and realizes that blood is oozing out of his head. That's what's in store for you tonight. When we get through with that match, you're going to realize once and for all why all the world calls me the King. And that's a promise.